What's up, people? What's up? Okay. Law 36. Law 36. 36. Disdain things you cannot have. Ignoring them is the best revenge. Judgment. By acknowledging a petty problem, you give it existence and credibility. The more attention you pay an enemy, the stronger you make him. And a small mistake is often made worse and more visible when you try to fix it. It's sometimes best to leave things alone. If there is something you want but cannot have, show contempt for me. The less interest you reveal, the more superior you seem. Transgression of the law. The Mexican rebel leader Pancho Villa started out as the chief of a gang of bandits, but after revolution broke out in Mexico in 1910, he became a kind of folk hero. Robbing trains and giving the money to the poor, leading daring raids and charming the ladies with romantic escapades. His exploits fascinated Americans. He seemed a man from another era, part Robin Hood, part Don Juan. After a few years of bitter fighting, however, General Carranza emerged as the victor in the revolution. The defeated Villa and his troops went back home to the northern state of Chihuahua. His army dwindled and he returned to banditry, again damaging his popularity. Finally, perhaps out of desperation, he began to rail against the United States, the gringos whom he blamed for his troubles. In March of 1916, Pancho Villa raided Columbus, New Mexico. Ramping through the town, he and his gang killed 17 American soldiers and civilians. President Woodrow Wilson, like many Americans, had Admiral Villa. Now, however, the bandit needed to be punished. Wilson's advisor urged him to send troops into Mexico to capture Villa. For a power as large as the United States, they argued not to strike back at an army that had invaded his territory would send the worst kind of signal. Furthermore, they continued. Many Americans saw Wilson as a pacifist, a principle the public doubted as a response to violence. He needed to prove his mental and manliness by ordering the use of force. The pressure on Wilson was strong, and before the month was out, with the approval of the Carranza government, he sent an army of 10,000 soldiers to capture Pancho Villa. The venture was called the Punitive Expedition, and its leader was the dashing General John J. Pershing, who had defeated guerrillas in the Philippines and Native Americans in the American Southwest. Certainly, Pershing could find and overpower Pancho Villa. The Punitive Expedition became a sensational story, and carloads of U.S. reporters followed Pershing into action. The campaign they wrote would be a test of American power. The soldiers carried the latest in weaponry, communicated by radio, and were supported by reconnaissance from the air. In the first few months, the troops split into small units to calm the wilds of northern Mexico. The Americans offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to Villa's capture, but the Mexican people, who had been disillusioned with Villa when he had returned to a banditry, now idolized him for facing this mighty American army. They began to give Pershing false leads. Villa had been seen in this village or in that mountain. High West airplane would be dispatched, troops would scurry after them, and no one would ever see him. The wily bandit seemed to be always one step ahead of the American military. By the summer of that year, the expedition had swelled to 123,000 men. They suffered through the stultifying heat, the mosquitoes, the wild terrain, trudging over the countryside in which they were already resented. They infuriated both the local people and the Mexican government. At one point, Pancho Villa hid in a mountain cave to recover from a gunshot wound he received in a skirmish with the Mexican army. Looking down from his eyrie, he could watch Pershing lead the exhausted American troops back and forth across the mountains, never getting any closer to their goal. All the way into winter, Villa played his cat and mouse game. Americans came to see the affairs as a kind of slapstick farce. In fact, they began to admire Villa again, respecting his resourcefulness in eluding a superior force. In January of 1970, Wilson finally ordered Pershing's withdrawal. As the troops made their way back to American territory, rebel forces pursued them, forcing the U.S. Army to use airplanes to protect its rear flanks. The Punitive Expedition was being punished itself. It had turned into a retreat of the most humiliating sort. Interpretation. Woodrow Wilson organized the Peabody expedition as a show of force. He would teach Pancho Villa a lesson and in the process show the world that no one, large or small, could attack the mighty United States and get away with it. The expedition would be over in a few weeks and Villa would be forgotten. That was not how it played out. The longer the expedition took, the more it focused attention on the Americans' incompetence and on Villa's cleverness. Soon what was forgotten was not Villa, but the raid that had started it all. As the minor annoyance became an international embarrassment and the enraged Americans dispatched more troops, the imbalance between the size of the pursuer and the size of the pursued, who still managed to stay free, made the affair a joke, and in the end, this white elephant of an army had to lumber out of Mexico, humiliated. The Peabody expedition did the opposite of what it set out to do. It left Villa not only free but more popular than ever. What could Wilson have done differently? He could have pressured the Carranza governor to catch Villa for him. Alternatively, since many Mexicans had died on Villa before the Peabody expedition began, he could have worked quietly with them and won their support for a much smaller rate to capture the bandit. He could have organized a trap on the American side of the border, anticipating the next raid, or he could have ignored the matter altogether for the time being, waiting for the Mexicans themselves to do away with Villa of their own accord. Remember, you choose to let things bother you. You can just as easily choose not to notice the irritating offender, to consider the matter trivial and unworthy of your interest. That is the powerful move. What you do not react to cannot drag you down in a futile engagement. Your pride is not involved. The best lesson you can teach an irritating gnat is to consign it to oblivion by ignoring it. If it's impossible to ignore, Pancho Villa had in fact killed American citizens, then conspired in secret to do away with it. But never inadvertently draw attention to the bothersome insect that will go away or die on its own. If you waste time and energy in such entanglement, it's your own fault. Learn to play the card of disdain and turn your back on what cannot harm you in the long run. Just think, it cost your government $130 million to try to get me. I took them over rough, hilly country, sometimes for 50 miles at a stretch. They had no water. They had nothing but the sun and mosquitoes, and nothing was gained. Pancho Villa, 1878-1923. Observance of the law. In the year 1527, King Henry VIII of England decided he had to find a way to get rid of his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had failed to produce a son, a male heir who would ensure the continuance of his dynasty, and Henry thought he knew why. He had read in the Bible the passage, "And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness, they shall be childless." Before marrying Henry, Catherine had married his older brother Arthur, but Arthur had died 5 months later. Henry had waited an appropriate time, then had married his brother's widow. Catherine was the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel of Spain, and by marrying her, Henry had kept alive a valuable alliance. Now, however, Catherine had to assure him that her brief marriage with Arthur had never been consummated. Otherwise, Henry would view their relationships as incestuous and their marriage as null and void. Catherine insisted that she had remained a virgin through her marriage to Arthur, and Pope Clement VIII supported her by giving his blessing to the union, which he could not have done had he considered it incestuous. Yet after years of marriage to Henry, Catherine had failed to produce a son, and in the early 1520s, she had entered menopause. To the king, this could only mean one thing. She had lied about her virginity, their union was incestuous, and God had punished them. There was another reason why Henry waited to get rid of Catherine. He had fallen in love with a younger woman, Anne Boleyn. Not only was he in love with her, but if he married her, he could still hope to sire a legitimate son. The marriage to Catherine had to be annulled. For this, however, Henry had to apply to the Vatican, but Pope Clement would never annul the marriage. By the summer of 1527, rumors spread throughout Europe that Henry was about to attempt the impossible, to annul his marriage against Clement's wishes. Catherine would never abdicate, let alone voluntarily enter a nunnery, as Henry had urged her. But Henry had his own strategy. He stopped sleeping in the same bed with Catherine, since he considered her his sister-in-law, not his lawful wife. He insisted on calling her princess. calling her Princess Dowager of Wales, her title as Arthur's Widow. Finally, in 1531, he banished her from court and shipped her off to a distant castle. The Pope ordered him to return her to court or pain of excommunication, the most severe penalty a Catholic could suffer. Henry not only ignored this threat, he insisted that his marriage to Catherine had been dissolved, and in 1533 he married Anne Boleyn. Clement refused to recognize the marriage, but Henry did not care. He no longer recognized the Pope's authority and proceeded to break with the Roman Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England in its stead, with the king as the head of the new church, and so not surprisingly the newly formed Church of England proclaimed Anne Boleyn England's rightful queen. The Pope tried every threat in the book, but nothing worked. Henry simply ignored him. Clement fumed. No one had ever treated him so contemptuously. Henry had humiliated him, and he had no power of recourse. Even excommunication, which he constantly threatened but never carried out, would no longer matter. Catherine too felt the devastating sting of Henry's disdain. She tried to fight back, but in appealing to Henry, her words fell on deaf ears, and soon they fell on no one's. Isolated from the court, ignored by the king, mad with anger and frustration, Catherine slowly deteriorated and finally died in January of 1536 from a cancerous tumor of heart. Okay. Interpretation. When you pay attention to a person, the two of you become patterns of sorts, each moving in step to the action and reaction of the other. In the process, you lose your initiative. It's a dynamic of all interactions. By acknowledging other people, even if only to fight with them, you open yourself to their influence. Had Henry locked horns with Catherine, he would have found himself mired in endless arguments that would have weakened his resolve and eventually worn him down. Catherine was a strong, stubborn woman. Had he set out to convince Clementine to change his verdict on the marriage's validity or try to compromise and negotiate with him, he would have gotten back down in Clement's favorite tactic, playing for time, promising flexibility, but actually getting what popes always got their way. Henry would have none of this. He played a devastating power game, total disdain. By ignoring people, you cancel them out. This unsettles and infuriates them, but since they have no dealings with you, there is nothing they can do. This is the offensive aspect of the law. Playing the card of contempt is immensely powerful, for it lets you determine the condition of the conflict. The war is waged on your terms. This is the ultimate power pose. You are the king and you ignore what offends you. Watch how this tactic infuriates people. Half of what they do is to get your attention, and when you withhold it from them, they flounder in frustration. Man, kick him, he'll forgive you. Flatter him, he may or may not see through you, but ignore him and he'll hate you. R.D.S. Shah, Caravan of Dreams, 1968. Ooh. Bye guys. Bye. Bye my beautiful audience. Beautiful audience.